All right. So, how did Harding and Calvin Coolidge epitomize small government and pro business strategies within their administration? Calvin Coolidge was Harding's vice president, and their entire administration was sort of centered around having businesses on top and very low government regulation. Now, Harding became president after World War One, and a lot of his thing and a lot of his candidacy was based about going back to normalcy, which was essentially the way of life before World War One, when everything was really relaxed, when everything was chill, and there was minimum federal government interference. Because after World War One, the government interfered in many small businesses and it started interfering in private life. And Harding wanted to go back on that, have less regulations, and focus more on domestic issues. Now, they did things such as reduce taxes, they lowered regulations, all in hopes to help small businesses and just businesses in general promote growth and economic industry within the US rather than focusing outside. Now, they also implemented what the banks implemented what was known as the Dawes Plan. And this was the way for America to get the money back that they had loaned out to the Allies during World War One. After World War One, the Allied forces did not have any money to pay the US back because they were already broke and now they're even more broke. They wanted Germany to pay them reparations so that they could then pay the Americans back, but Germany was also broke after the war. So the banks decided to come up with a Dawes Plan so that America could get some of its money back and the banks wouldn't collapse, destroying the entire economy of America. Basically what it was American banks would loan Germany money. Germany would take that money, pay it to the Allied forces like Britain and France in the form of reparations, and then the Allied forces would then just pay it back to America for the war loans that they got. And that was essentially how Harding and Calvin Coolidge epitomized businesses. Their entire thing was less government regulation, go back to the way before World War One, and focus on domestic issues. Okay, so how did the new consumer culture of the 1920s work, and who benefited from it and who did not? Basically, during the 1920s, credit and commercial advertising was becoming very much more popular. Credit allowed people and American citizens to purchase things now and pay for it later. Things like credit cards where you would buy right now and then you wouldn't have to worry about paying it till the end of the month. And this allowed for commercial advertising. They became much more sophisticated, targeting the psychology and promoting like a very luxurious consumer life, because even people that necessarily couldn't afford it right at that moment could buy it on credit and pay for it later or pay for it in installments. And then after the introduction of labor-saving devices such as like the washing machine, the refrigerator, the dryer, things of that nature, people kept on buying those perceived luxury items on credit to make their life better. And the Model T, the ideology that the Ford Model T was created on kind of contributed to that, because the Model T was all about efficiency, it was about affordability, and getting to a lot more people than just the rich. And the labor-saving devices were on that same track where it was about the entire people and not just the wealthy class. Now, this was not necessarily beneficial for every single person. While on the surface it seemed amazing that people are getting these new things, this entire consumer strategy really only helped business owners. They were able to have open shops, which essentially meant that workers did not have any union rights, and they were treated really poorly. So the business owners took advantage of all these new consumers purchasing things, but the workers were still being paid very much little. Their wages were very stagnant, and business profits kept on soaring and soaring and soaring, but the workers saw none of that gain. And any tries at a strike were stopped by both the government, because remember that Harding and Coolidge wanted low government regulation, so the government did not do anything to help the workers, and then the business owners just kept on suppressing strikes. African Americans during this time were also very much negatively impacted. They could not contribute any new jobs. They did not have any opportunity to take part of it. Any ability to make their life better, they could not be a part of that. There was a lot of discrimination, and African Americans were kept to their area and kept to the low-paying jobs. So on the surface level, a lot of people were able to purchase things and live what was at the time perceived as a luxury life, but the everyday person, the workers, and African Americans still suffered really, really horrible conditions. Okay, so what was the island hopping campaigns and how did it actually lead to the defeat of Japan? So island hopping was essentially when the US forces took over less fortified islands around the Japanese area rather than targeting the big islands that were really, really heavily fortified. And then they used that advantageous position of having those less fortified islands to keep on progressing forward and having that ability to weaken Japan, weaken their forces, lower their resources, and then be able to take on bigger islands as they went. And in the beginning, this was a really good idea because it made sure that America was strategic about the way they were going about the war against Japan. However, the Japanese would rather die than surrender, and so things like when they were trying to conquer Guadalcanal, it was a lot more rigorous than they expected. The Japanese were not willing to give up. They kept on fighting to their death, and then eventually they were defeated, with the Japanese Navy being essentially destroyed after the Battle of Midway because the US had gotten rid of so many of the Japanese resources. They destroyed aircraft carriers, and they just overall weakened their power. And this was the Battle of Midway was a huge turning point in the war against Japan. However, the Iwo Jima and Okinawa were still really problematic at gaining. Again, the Japanese would rather die than surrender, so they had like suicide bombers such as the Kamizaki attacks. I'm so sorry, I'm butchering that. And so a lot of Americans actually ended up dying with those suicide bombers, and all of a sudden Japanese being so rigorous and not willing to give up, which is what they honestly thought. And that's what led to the atomic bombs being used. Originally, the idea was that America would keep fighting and they would end up losing hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans in this war, and it would go on for so much longer. But with just one press of a button, an atomic bomb would be launched that completely wipes out all of Japan's power and Japanese people. And so that's when the first bomb, Hiroshima, was launched, and it killed thousands and thousands of Japanese people and absolutely leveled their city. But again, Japan still did not surrender. They were not willing to give up, and that's what led to the second Nagasaki attack, which killed even more people and finally caused Japan to surrender. So while the island hopping campaigns was originally a really good idea of getting less fortified areas to keep getting an advantageous position for heavy fortified areas, the sheer power of the Japanese people surprised America at things like the Battle of Guadalcanal, and then taking over Okinawa and Iwo Jima proved to be a lot more harder than they originally thought, and ended up having to actually use atomic bombs to win the war against Japan. Okay, so what was the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan, and how did it carry out the containment policy during the Cold War era? So during this time, after World War II, the Cold War was kind of ramping up, and the U.S. had partnered with the Soviet Union during World War II to destroy Germany. However, as outlined in NSC-68, a form that was published, the American government believed that the Soviet Union would want to take over the world, and if they're not stopped, they would actually succeed in this mission. They believed that the only way to stop them was through containment and putting up policies that prevented communism from spreading, which went against basically every single American ideal. And so the US government did not want communism and did not want Russia to spread its communistic ideas across Europe. And that was the purpose of the containment policy, essentially put a block around and quarantine Russia to prevent it from spreading their communistic ideals. And the way they accomplished this was through the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. What the Truman Doctrine was it provided direct military aid for countries that were being attacked by modern-day Russia or the Soviet Union at the time, so that they wouldn't be taken over by the communistic ideals. So they sent military aid, they sent money, possibly even soldiers, all to help those countries fight the war against Soviet Union. And then the Marshall Plan, which is also often referred to as the soft plan, instead of providing direct military aid, it provided them with aid to help rebuild the countries after the war, or give them enough money to have a really good life in Europe so that they wouldn't even want to look towards these communistic ideals that Russia was offering, because they were already having a really, really good life and they didn't care for them. They didn't want them, and they were fine living their democratic way, their American way, and didn't care about the Russian communistic way that American sort of hated. And so both of these plans carried out containment. It ensured that Russia wouldn't continue spreading its ideas, and that the people that were the highest targets wouldn't even want them to begin with, ensuring that Russian ideology was quarantined within the Soviet Union. All right, so how did the U.S. deal with internal communist subversion during the early Cold War years? So the U.S. government thought that the Soviet Union wanted to take over the entire world, and part of that was through internal subversion, which essentially meant that they would have communistic spies within countries such as the U.S. that would destroy and promote these communistic ideas from within the country. And they wanted to get rid of them. Once this was kind of thought about and found out about, it was really fearful and horrifying for Americans. And so the way they identified internal subversaries, or people that they thought to be Russian spies, was basically any person that held a liberal view was a communist subvert. Any person that had any communistic or socialist idea was labeled as a subvert, and they were labeled as a traitor. Oftentimes, people that were associated with the LGBTQA+ were also labeled as communist subverts, because it was believed they had a lot of leverage. The Soviet Union had leverage to blackmail them, and saying that they would reveal their secrets to everyone during this time. Obviously, LGBTQA+ was not treated fairly. So internal subversion just becoming more and more problematic after Alger Hiss, a high-ranking U.S. government official, was convicted of espionage against America and giving secrets to the Soviet Union. Basically, what this did was it ruined morale for so many people, because they believed him to be a perfect all-around American that would never do anything bad. And once he was proved to have done espionage against America and given secrets, it prompted so much fear across American citizens, because if this perfect American could be capable of doing something so terrible, who else was in the government and who else was around me that was also a traitor? So this fear essentially led to the creation of the House of Un-American Activities Committee, which was responsible for finding out these people who were Russian and communistic spies, and finding these internal subverts. This is when things started to get out of hand. They were looking for disloyal people within the U.S. government, but they didn't really have any concrete method of going about it. So they started preventing gays from getting jobs within the government, because, again, the gays had, and like any LGBTQA person, had a lot of blackmail that the Soviets could use against them to get that leverage. And so they couldn't get jobs, and then anytime someone was asked to testify in front of the House of Un-American Committee, was just instantly labeled as a traitor, because just the idea of going up was so un-American that you were a traitor if someone even thought that you had the ability to do that. And it was not a perfect system, and it definitely wasn't a good system at all, and it actually ended up impacting Hollywood, which is surprising. During the time, Hollywood was majorly made up of Jewish people, and a lot of people at the time thought Jewish ideology was communistic. And so anti-communistic meant anti-Semitism. A lot of screenwrites on Hollywood were Jewish people, and those people, again, Jews, were thought to have communistic ideas, so they thought that any person that was Jewish doing a screenwrite was actually using Hollywood as a platform to spread communistic ideals and, again, brainwash Americans from the inside using cinema and movies to convince them that communism was good. Whether this was happening or not, again, they had no proof. And Senator Joseph McCarthy was another person that just contributed to this problem. He had absolutely no proof for accusing a bunch of people, 205 people, that they were known spies within the U.S. government. During a speech, he stated that he knew that 205 people within the U.S. government were known spies and had absolutely no proof. A lot of his accusations actually ended up being correct, and it gave him a lot of platform and a lot of fame that that really prompted Americans to kind of, in a way, look up to him because he was correct. And he had been throwing out some wild accusations there as well. He had said that the Harry Truman administration was actually was working with the Soviet Union to destroy America, but he'd been right in the past and people thought he would be right again. But eventually he ended up actually hurting himself when he made fun of a beloved American newscaster. The citizens were not happy. Now this person was really, really much more loved and much more respected than McCarthy. And when McCarthy went on his own news channel and made fun of that newscaster, the American citizens just was not having it, and he ended up losing all of his fame as fast as he got it.